The concept of Springlock suits were first established on March 2nd, 2015, with the release of Five Nights at Freddy's 3, a costume that can be worn by both an animatronic and a person. Springlocks are the main mechanism that allows the suit to go from animatronic mode to a wearable costume. Using a hand crank, you can pull the spring locks back, which have animatronic parts attached, and once the locks are fully compressed against the inside of the suit, there is enough room for a person to climb inside and wear it like a costume. The only downside to this is if the spring locks go from their compressed state to their decompressed state, the animatronic parts that were originally held off to the side will go back to their position as if they were on an animatronic. However, if you are still wearing the suit when this happens, the endoskeleton parts that are inside of the suit will try to shift to where your bones are. For example, the legs. This is where your legs will be if you are wearing the costume. But if the spring locks fail, say goodbye to that fucking leg. Needless to say, if you are still wearing a spring lock suit when this kind of failure happens, you're gonna be in for a very slow and painful death. If you want to know more about the specifications of spring locks and how they work or why they tend to fail in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe, I recommend watching my previous video on this subject, a video that many of you may have already watched. Today's video isn't going to be all about the intricate designs and mechanisms of a spring lock suit. Instead, I'll be going over all instances of a spring lock failure in the Five Nights at Freddy's series. Whether it be in the games, the books, or the movie, all of which will be covered in this video. I give a quick analysis as to why and how the spring locks failed, and how it affected the person wearing the suit. The first official spring lock failure we ever saw was in Five Nights at Freddy's 3, the very game that introduced the concept of it. William Afton, in an attempt to ward off the ghosts of the children he had previously taken the lives of, puts on the very suit he wore when he took their lives, trying to scare them away by reminding them of what he had put them through in their final moments, when suddenly a spring lock failure occurred. But why? Well, for starters, the room that the springlock suit was in had water leaking from the ceiling. It is known in the franchise that if you get the spring locks wet, they will most definitely become decompressed, or at the very least become highly unstable. The suit he wore was old, and it appeared to have not been given proper maintenance, given how one of the ears was missing and how discolored the suit looks compared to the previous minigames. All of this alongside his laughing, causing him to breathe directly on these highly unstable spring locks, leads to him experiencing an unimaginably brutal death. The blood from the initial spring locks most likely leaked into the other parts of the suit, which caused even more spring locks to go off, making his chances of survival completely futile, in a room with no escape. A strong start to the list, and the one scene everyone draws inspiration from when they make their own interpretations of the spring lock failure. This game is one that's not mentioned too much whenever spring locks are discussed. Many people tend to forget, but in this game there is a spring lock suit, and the character you play as on night 4 is inside of this suit. Not much is known about this suit except that instead of having a hand crank to wind back the spring locks, you instead have to wind each lock back individually. I'm not sure why this is the case. Spring locks don't slowly unwind, they are either compressed or decompressed. It leads me to believe that this is an entirely different mechanism at play, which unfortunately doesn't get any further explanations in the series. We can speculate that since these locks slowly unwind as opposed to just shooting into position, they instead very slowly crush you with the animatronic parts in the case of a spring lock failure. Which, give or take, could be worse than what we're used to. Now, as much as I wish I could discuss a scene in this game where the spring locks fully fail and unwind all the way, unfortunately, in this game, that doesn't happen. Well, the spring locks do fail because whenever they unwind all the way, you do lose, but instead of having a brutal POV shot of you getting crushed by the costume's internal pieces, you instead just get jump scared. A bit disappointing that we did not get a POV shot of what it would look like to get spring locked, but that's just the way it is. I know I said I wasn't going to get into the intricate designs of Springlock suits, but I think in this circumstance it is warranted. In the books, the suits have a bit more safety protocols in mind, which is a huge step for Fazbear Entertainment. For example, a fastener is on the back, where if a small Springlock failure were to occur, where if it happens in like your foot or hand, you could quickly take apart the back section of the suit, maneuver your way out of it, and have a fighting chance for survival. This is what William Afton appears to have done in the past, since it is quite obvious that he has survived a previous Springlock failure. It's never mentioned when or how it occurred, but we do know that it did happen, and he did live, which when I first saw it, I thought was impossible. But it appears the mechanisms that are used on these Springlock suits are different from the ones in the games. In this Springlock suit, clamps and rods are used to hold the spare parts in place. In costume mode, the clamps are pulled back, with enough room for someone to fit inside. The scars on William's body do not look like there was metal rods being forced to where his bones are. They look like a bunch of metal clamps all over his body. So, this suit could be a little bit less fatal than the ones in the games. Something else that is different about these suits compared to the games is how resilient these ones are. William can move around quite freely, being shown grabbing, attacking, and even dancing, but he also knows to show some delicacy with the suit's handling. It can be assumed that the suit in the novels is of way higher maintenance than the one seen in Five Nights at Freddy's 3, which in return could lead him to make all of these movements without a failure occurring immediately. Despite that, William still gets spring-locked. This time, it is fatal. Charlotte hits one of the spring locks around the neck, making it come loose, causing a total spring-lock failure. It first happens on the headpiece of the animatronic costume before anything else. William screams in pain as the initial locks begin to fail. There is no chance of escaping this using the fastener on the back, because it already happened in the headpiece, leading to an overall similar death to Five Nights at Freddy's 3, with blood all over the place, both still twitching from the spring locks. In the graphic novel, I thought it was going to be a bit more exaggerated from a visual standpoint, but I digress. The Five Nights at Freddy's movie has the most recent occurrence of a spring lock failure in the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise. Since this one has the longest screen time, I'll be talking about it a bit more than the ones previously mentioned. The spring lock suits in the movie are, I've got to say, the most resilient ones we've seen thus far. While wearing this suit, William can full-on kick, attack, and even get shot without the spring locks failing. Alongside that, there is another scene where William takes his headpiece and throws it on the ground. In the books, this type of action would have caused a spring lock failure, an action that even William Afton in the books seems to shy away from, even though that costume looked like it had been given proper maintenance. But in this case with the movie, it doesn't look like the suit has been given proper maintenance at all. If anything, it looks like Afton just now got his hands on it after it had been abandoned for many years. With all the movements he does and the amount of combat he's doing, you'd think at least one spring lock would have gone off due to the suit's condition. But no, not even him getting shot activated these spring locks. Now, is this because the spring lock mechanisms in the movie are different from the ones in the books and the games? There's no telling. The spring locks in the movie are not explained as much as they are in the game and book. Perhaps I'm looking too far into it. Let's cut to the real reason we're here. The spring locks finally decompress whenever a large section of the suit is ripped off by an animatronic, and one by one the spring locks all slowly start to fail. It has always been explained that this would be a long and drawn-out brutal death, but for some reason in the game and the book, they make it look like it happens so goddamn fast. The movie encapsulates the concept of a slow death very nicely. It takes an entire minute just for what we can assume is all of the spring locks to fail. The sounds of the mechanisms closing and the sharp winces of William after each part of the costume's interior slowly but surely punctures his organs gives a good demonstration of how slow a spring lock failure would actually be under certain circumstances. Although, many people were a bit underwhelmed by this scene. Due to the lack of blood and screaming during the spring lock failure, people were a little bit upset it did not live up to their expectations. To be fair, every iteration of William's springlock failure up until this point had a shit ton of blood, and the books depicted him screaming in pain the whole way through. However, the very first mechanism to fail in the movie got him directly in the lungs. Previous iterations were not first stabbed in the chest, so it could have given them a little bit of time to yell in pain. Now I say that, but only seconds later, William picks up the headpiece and says, "I always come back." Which, great. It's a great callback to Pizzeria Simulator. However, if your airways are filling up with your own blood, you're not gonna be able to fucking talk. Speaking of blood, that is the one thing I've noticed that was a deficit in this scene. William falls to the ground and there's not even a fucking drop of blood. If this was a true springlock failure, there should have been blood everywhere. I know the movie was rated PG-13, okay? I understand the circumstances. With that being said, I cannot really harp on it all that much. It gave us our first look at a springlock failure from an official cinematic perspective, and I have to give it respect for that. Common misconceptions. I know at least one of you might be wondering why I haven't mentioned Five Nights at Freddy's 4 on this list of springlock failures. Many people believe to this day that the bite that killed one of William's sons was indeed a springlock failure, which doesn't make much sense. Don't get me wrong, these are springlock suits, but what happened on that day was not a mechanical mishap. The springlocks cannot fail if they are already put in their animatronic mode. As I've previously discussed, the only way a failure can happen is if it rapidly snaps out of costume mode and goes into animatronic mode. If it is already in animatronic mode, it cannot fail. This incident was simply the animatronic continuing its idle stance coding, which just so happened to have its mouth opening and closing during this movement, and putting a child's head in between a mechanism that is designed to open and shut regularly isn't a good idea, you stupid fucks. Anyway, the point is, this is not a springlock failure. Alright, that about wraps up this video. I've heard of a new Five Nights at Freddy's themed game coming out called Into the Pit. I'm not sure if a springlock failure scene is gonna happen in that game, but if one does, I guess I fucking missed out on covering it. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to show support to my channel. If you believe I missed anything in this video, feel free to comment down below what exactly I missed. Anyways, with all of this being said, I will see all of you in the next video.